Hey, Eleanor.
Good morning.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Ready to do the stream?
I'm ready to go. I've enjoyed the opportunity to actually reflect a little bit on my notes from Gartner and remember some of the things lost in the blur of a big conference. So looking forward to it.
All right, good stuff. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the stream. I'm Kyle Kirwan, co-founder and CEO at Bigeye.
And Eleanor Treharne-Jones, Chief Operating Officer here at Bigeye.
And I think you gathered this already, but we went to Gartner Data and Analytics Summit last week in Orlando, Florida, and took a bunch of notes from the sessions that we attended there. And so today I'm excited to recap what we saw. And I think we should have some slides up here. There we go. Awesome. So this was a 3-day conference. There was a little bit on Sunday, but it was mostly Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And we were there in full force manning the Bigeye booth and also attending a bunch of great sessions. So maybe you can start us off. Eleanor, you went to the keynote session, I think, while I was at the booth. And you told me that the keynote session was all about execution and business value and that there was a pretty fun number that got thrown out there. What was that?
Absolutely. Well, there was a few actually as I went back to my notes. Overall, as a conference, Gartner's overriding message was it's around collective intelligence and building business value together. And they shared in the keynote, which Etisham led, a study of 300 data leaders. And there were some interesting bullet points that I was going to share from that. One of the ones that I think is super valuable is they came up with a direct correlation between data analytics maturity and financial performance of the organizations they worked with. And for anyone in this space, and that is a super powerful stat as you're looking to justify further investment in data and analytics and in your team. And so again, very helpful nugget from Gartner that can be kind of taken forward and used. A couple of other more interesting ones whilst I'm throwing stats here. 50% say they've already delivered data products and self-service analytics, and 75% of chief data analytics officers say they've already tried Gen AI. So interesting kind of benchmarks as we look at this kind of thing. But as I said to you, the one real takeaway that I remembered when I came away from the session was Gartner was really focused not on strategy, but on execution. And I think that was a theme across the whole conference. And they shared a case study in the opening keynote, which kind of really doubled down saying you should be focused 3% on strategy and 97% on execution. And so that really was kind of like one of my big takeaways from that opening session. And one other little anecdote I'll add in is they said, be prepared to spread yourself thin and learn the art of survivable disappointment.
And did they say what they meant by that? That's obviously it's not a confidence-inspiring statement, but might be a real one for anybody who's actually been leading a data team for a while.
The reality, it's part of their focus on execution. So it's about choosing what to do and what not to do. And that really being the kind of, where they felt the, data teams are now, as opposed to that kind of more theoretical, strategic vision stage of the business.
And do you think this was kind of a shocker? Well, maybe not a shocker, but I think the concern that maybe a lot of people had was that there's going to be a ton of Gen AI plastered all over everything. It was going to be super visionary. Everybody was going to be talking about the amazing stuff that they're doing with Gen AI and kind of like hoping that nobody else pointed out the sort of governance challenges or the metadata management challenges with that. And then the reality on the ground at the conference was actually much more pragmatic and realistic, which was nice. Sometimes, like as an industry, we get pretty carried away with new stuff. And obviously Gen AI has been huge and has actually been some really interesting, developments in the space. So I think there was a pretty high likelihood that we showed up at the conference and there was sort of breathless, waxing poetic about what could be done. And then, like you said, the reality was like the execution has to actually be right. You have to have a plan to get this done in a real way, and you have to be able to communicate like what can and can't be done, what's realistic, and that's all like super practical advice that organizations should really be listening to.
Yeah, last year was the year of the shiny object. You couldn't go to a single data conference without it all being about AI. And that filtered obviously into other parts of the industry as well. But this definitely, and I was surprised by how quickly it had moved on, but there was definitely this sense that AI is now business as usual. and you should build it. I think it's on our next slide, but you should build it into all of our, all of your existing programs rather than treat it as a separate initiative. So in the keynote, they were talking about, data literacy initiatives. Put AI into your existing data literacy initiative rather than build a separate, AI program and keep kind of segmenting it out. So yeah, really surprising and interesting to see how quickly that evolution has taken place, and the role that Gartner sees for AI moving forward.
I mean, hopefully it's just because, like, again, as an industry, we've kind of like gone through cycles a few times now, and there's business intelligence, there's big data, then there's sort of the wave of like now what would be called traditional machine learning or traditional AI, which is kind of funny, but like we've kind of gone through this cycle enough times at this point that maybe everybody kind of understands the metagame around it now. And once the initial shock of what could be done with LLMs and that kind of thing set in, so this is a great segue into the next slide, but you should be applying governance, and you should probably be thinking about governing Gen AI and sort of more modern AI models in a very similar framework that you've been thinking about data governance in the past for things like analytics. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's something that we would have advocated for, but I was surprised to see it come through as such a strong theme in the conference, that really the role of a chief data officer is to drive good governance, and that be the foundation for your AI initiatives, which I know sounds obvious, but really just even that word governance was such a driving theme across the whole conference, and it felt like data teams generally have done a good job of harnessing the momentum around Gen AI to really align with a number of initiatives that people have been working on for a long time and create kind of a strong push factor behind those existing good governance programs.
And I mean, notably, what's absent is sort of a completely new approach or a new wave to looking at governance. I mean, I think data catalog vendors, data observability vendors like ourselves, there's a lot of folks in the industry that are looking at, okay, how do we take solutions that work for everything else in the data space, and what, if anything, needs to be adapted to be able to support Gen AI being part of the initiative for the data team. But you don't see like a completely new crop of separate vendors popping up just to tackle governance for Gen AI as like a completely separate sliced off space.
Correct. And you're right, actually. If you think of, it was a Gartner keynote, there was no new shiny thing. It was all about kind of getting on with the job and doing a good job and executing well. I think, so yes, I don't think either on the vendor show floor or in the content was there any kind of new category opening up this year. Vendors are incorporating AI into their existing solutions rather than bringing AI solutions to the market. And in the same way as the Gartner content was kind of driving this idea that AI is baked in to what you're doing, whether it's in your day-to-day or whether it's in kind of visionary or more kind of category defining type initiatives. So yes, very much business as usual. They did end with this idea that it's a career defining moment, though. So no pressure on that execution, but that was their kind of final takeaway. Another thing they highlighted as well is about storytelling, and saying that as an industry we weren't very good at storytelling. So when you're talking about business value, how do we translate that away from the tools and the practical things that we're putting in place to do that kind of data storytelling? And they gave an example of where a team had showed a return on investment of, I think, 7% for a data initiative that they put in place. I can't remember what the specific case study was. And then some external consultants had come in and actually shown that the value was 28%. And it was really just about better value storytelling that the external consultants were bringing versus perhaps what the internal team was attributing to the effort that they put in.
Oh, I think I did a post about this maybe a few weeks ago, which was that if somebody on the data team can't speak very clearly to the value that they're providing to the business, like what's at the end of the data pipeline and what is the business actually using with whatever's at the end of the pipeline, that's like a fundamental cultural problem on the data team. If you don't understand the dollars and cents of, you may be several steps removed from what's actually happening in the business that's generating revenue off of what you're doing on the data platform, but you at least need to understand what it is from a logical perspective. And so I'm not surprised that you're able to bring in people that are used to doing consulting and having to very strongly justify their ROI and the outputs, and they're able to do a better job at that. It's sort of it's internal marketing or it's internal sales, and that might not be things that data teams have historically been good at, but it's going to be easier with Gen AI, perhaps. There's a lot of interest at the C level, from what I'm hearing, in what these types of projects can do. So there's sort of this like high time right now where you can go and capitalize on that and show a lot of really powerful customer facing value or partner facing value or wherever you're applying those models. But yeah, you have to kind of bring that marketing or sales lens to it to make sure that you're showing the full benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I was able to go to that session. I think you were able to go to the augmented data quality session. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts and takeaways from that.
Yeah, that's right. So the Magic Quadrant for augmented data quality. Now, I remember sort of in the early days of Bigeye, data quality monitoring, augmented data quality, data observability. There were like a lot of phrases to refer to like these new ways of looking at and dealing with data quality. So when I first saw augmented data quality, I was like, is that going to include some of the data observability vendors, or is that like how much overlap is there in the categories? So that was like a big question mark for me, is like, where is the Venn diagram in, from Gartner's perspective on data quality, data observability. And one of the things I got from this is that this particular quadrant is non-overlapped. So this was very focused on, we're using data quality rules, we're using profiling, we're using sort of data quality tests or checks, these sort of pass-fail conditions, more of a traditional lens on data quality. And then we're bringing automation and intelligence to how those tests and checks get created. And so something that was interesting to me about this was seeing the vendors that are included in the quadrant first off, and to not see Bigeye, not see your Monte Carlos or Excel Datas or Anomalos, any of the sort of self-described data observability vendors were all absent from this. So that was my sort of top takeaway, is that there, at least in Gartner's perspective, there is a clear distinction between augmented data quality and observability, which we'll talk about some more later, because there's a whole session just on observability. But also what was interesting for me was hearing some of the advice on how to interpret the quadrant. So obviously everybody, they open the quadrant, they're going to look up in the leaders section, right, in the upper right. Like that's sort of your natural reaction. But there's actually some very interesting advice from Melody about how to interpret and use the entire square or the entire quadrant, not just the leader section. And so like one example from the advice that she gave is that you need to understand your specific use cases. And some of the vendors that may be not in the leader section, because they don't do everything in the space, they don't meet sort of all the criteria that could be met in the particular category, they focus on a subset of it. And so they go into that niche section of the quadrant in the lower left. But you can get really great pricing sometimes from those vendors if that vendor specifically addresses the use case that you have, versus if you have a huge smattering of different use cases, you may be forced to go into the leader section, but you're also going to pay leader prices at that point. There's some other advice about navigating the other areas of the quadrant as well that was super interesting. But that was a level of sophistication in interpreting the information in the quadrant that I think is usually lacking from the conversation. And it's Melody from Gartner who's presenting it, so that makes sense. But as somebody kind of on the outside, to actually hear that level of sophistication in what you can use the quadrant for, other than just look in the upper right corner, that was kind of a big takeaway for me. And
also your takeaway is that these therefore are two completely distinct, solution sets, augmented data quality and data observability. And given that Gartner is producing the Magic Quadrant on augmented data quality, that these will continue to exist side by side.
That's how I imagine it's going to go. So, as I said, we'll talk in a lot of detail about the observability update that Melody gave, that went into a lot of detail about where is the market right now when it comes to observability. There's sort of the 5 pillars that I think she announced maybe a year ago now. So there's a lot of review on that. But this to me from this presentation looks like this is very distinctly at this point a different approach. And it validates something that we've been talking about for a long time, which is that data quality rules are a useful tool, and they certainly have their place. But data observability is a fundamentally different paradigm for even trying to look at the problem, which is that you should understand the full state of everything that's going on in the pipeline, with the pipeline infrastructure, inside the content of the data. And that is a different question than we have a set or a corpus of rules, and can we pass the data through those rules and then look for which records pass and fail and that kind of thing. So totally different approaches and fundamentally some different use cases. And so I think that to see that the two categories are so clearly divided, I think is encouraging for me, because it reinforces that division between traditional data quality with the augmentation, with the intelligence aspect, which is still a huge improvement from, human beings having to write the rules manually, but still fundamentally a different challenge than observability.
Absolutely. And anything that helps bring clarity to the market, I think, is going to be hugely, hugely welcomed. So we're obviously both itching to talk about data observability. I did feel that this was a conference where the position and role of data observability was really solidified. And I'll just, on a more kind of anecdotal basis, when I first went to the Gartner Data Analytics Summit 2 years ago, there was no session on data observability. There was a lot of vendors starting to talk about it. There was a lot of kind of, introducing and selling the category as opposed to specific tools and solutions within the category. Last year was the first time that there was a session on data observability on the agenda, but it was at 4 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon. This is a 3-day conference from Monday to Wednesday. Nearly everybody, the conference ends at like 4:30, so nearly every single person is about to get a flight. And so people were standing there, suitcases in hand, if you were specifically dedicated to catching that data observability session. And this year, data observability was, middle of the day on a Tuesday, in the middle of the conference in a kind of prime time slot. And so just one kind of additional indication that, Gartner has talked about this a lot and invested a lot of, time and analyst resources in really kind of shaping their thoughts around the market. But it really felt like that had come home this year.
I agree. And sorry, I have a fire truck outside. I agree. I also saw this on the showcase floor. So in previous years, we always ask, when somebody, would come up to the booth and talk to us, do you know what data observability is? Have you heard about it before? And the ratio of people that answer yes or no to that question has changed dramatically year after year. And I think that coincides at the same time with more primetime placement of the session on observability. Last year, I think it was a presentation that was showcasing those 5 pillars, I think for the first time. Correct. Whereas this year, it was reinforcing those 5 pillars again. And I think that all these signs sort of point to there's more interest in the space. Gartner's giving it more airtime. They also got more excited this time about talking about the future. So before it was much more like, what is the category? What's here? How do you break it down? Who's in the space? There is a more forward-looking aspect this time. But you mentioned we've mentioned the 5 pillars a few times, so I think it's worth spending a minute on that. So I think for me, the main thing on the 5 categories here was last year we saw the 5 categories, which were content, pipelines, infrastructure usage, and spend or FinOps. And one of the things that Melody pointed out this year at the presentation is there is still no vendor who's tackling all 5 of those categories in a material way, such that you have any sort of like all-in-wonder kind of vendor. So that showed that while there's a lot of growing interest in the space, and while Gartner's recognizing or hearing that interest, and that's driving them to put the sessions in a more primetime location, we still as an industry haven't caught up to covering all 5 of those categories. And I'm sure that, you go talk to any company like ourselves that's in the area, there might be features here and there that help touch on some of those, but nobody is like completely nailing all 5 of those categories such that you could just go to that company and have the whole thing solved.
And I think it might be worth kind of just taking a couple of steps back to you listed them very quickly, just to actually kind of go through for anyone that wasn't at the conference exactly what those categories are. I think what what I agree with you on is what's interesting is they haven't changed from last year. So Gartner kind of put a stake in the ground last year as to what the potential scope of data observability might be. It was much broader than any company in the market was looking at last year. It still remains a broad and ambitious scope, which increasingly companies are kind of covering. But I thought it was very interesting that the scope hadn't changed. So again, some kind of stabilization of how this market is evolving. But let's take them one by one. So, and just perhaps give a quick our take on Gartner, what Gartner means by that. So the first one is data quality.
Yep. So I think this is the thing that most people think about first. So it's the content, what's going on inside the data set. So freshness, validity, consistency, completeness, the sort of more traditional, like what's going on inside the tables that are moving through the pipeline, how quickly are they moving through the pipeline. So I think this is like probably the most common category that data observability companies are tackling. It's where we started out for sure. And it's probably also the closest to, augmented data quality.
But it's different in that you're proactively and continuously monitoring versus your kind of existing data quality checks that you might have put in place. So that's the first one. The next one is then pipeline. So the data pipeline.
Yep. So this was talking about, are jobs running? Are they failing out? How long are they taking to run? What's the performance of the jobs? So this was about, the moving the data through the pipeline. Personally, I've thought about, and when we talk about that with our customers, we always talk about pipeline monitoring first, because we talk about schema changes, we talk about the lineage, we talk about the flow of the data, and usually that's like the domain or the concern of your data engineering team or your platform team. And then we move on to talking about content. It is interesting that they choose to list content first, but it's also, again, like I said, it might be the most intuitive thing that folks are thinking about if they're coming from a sort of data quality context. But that was that second category, is the pipeline and sort of the what's moving the data through the environment.
Agreed. And it's kind of the area where there is the broadest, or the deepest, actually, the opposite of broad, the deepest coverage within the vendors in this space, and kind of, I think, really the original core of the data observability category.
That's where they have the most vendors listed, was in pillar 2.
Yeah. And then just teeing this up for the audience. So then the next one is obviously infrastructure monitoring, which is a very established category. And I think one of the more unusual ones. So if you're looking at kind of, application performance monitoring, I think it was one of the most unusual steps of Gartner to consider that category might become absorbed into data observability, the kind of new upstart. So that I think is very, very interesting. But that's the third category, the third pillar.
But with the lens on it, though, that it's focused on the scope of CPU, memory, things like that, for whatever's running Airflow, or for your data warehouse, or for wherever you're storing the data. So to me, this one it's a little bit related to pipeline monitoring. So I guess the difference is, with pipeline monitoring, we're thinking about job execution, whereas with infrastructure monitoring, we're thinking about the physical infrastructure that the jobs are getting run by. But so in that sense, yeah, this is probably where you might want to be able to apply like a Datadog or something like that, because they have all the instrumentation to do it. It's just that they're specifically talking about it in the context of just the infrastructure that's driving the data platform, as opposed to like the broader, everything that you might be monitoring if you're using Datadog or Dynatrace or whatever across the whole org.
And ultimately, the interplay between the two. Because at the moment, those are operating in different systems for the most part. And so there's no ability as a team to see whether, if something breaks down on the infrastructure side, whether that has an impact on the data, and vice versa. And so obviously that is a more natural evolution. Being
able to correlate, we see that like memory is fully utilized over here, and at the same time we're seeing that like these jobs are failing over there. And then looking at the first pillar, we now see that we have a freshness issue with the these 50 tables, because they all have a dependency on that job.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if all that information is sitting in Datadog, then you don't have that ability to use those additional triggers and obviously push that into models as well. Okay, and then two more, probably the one that's least talked about, but data usage, kind of access controls. I've seen the fewest vendors kind of really focused on this space. I don't know your thoughts on the data usage pillar.
Well, not just controls, but I think Melody also mentioned things like who's using which data sets are the most popular, what are the top queries that get executed. This was definitely something that I would normally think of as a data cataloging question. But I would expect to open a catalog and look at, let's say, our users 360 table and see like who are the top users on this table. Like, here's some folks from data science, here's a few folks from an analytics team. And be able to see who those are? Or do we have queries that we run on that same table over and over and over again? Like, do we have a set of queries that runs on that table every single day? All of that falls into that sort of usage category. So who's using it? How much is it being used? One of the things that we built into Bigeye long ago natively was popularity ranking for data sets, but that was more of a usability enhancement. Because you go and open up a catalog, you have 10,000 tables in there. Like, what's the most intuitive way to present the important stuff? You rank the popularity, you float those up to the top in the catalog. So we've actually implemented some of this. Like I said earlier, like no vendors covering all 5 categories in a meaningful way. We have technically done some work in this category, and I think some others in the space have as well, just not sort of fully to deliver on the use case of completely understanding usage. But there's some toes that have been put in the water here. But yeah, in addition to access control, sort of that like who's using it and how much question, I think, is answered by this pillar.
Yeah. And then the final one, which I think has caused the most conversation when it was first introduced last year, was when, and I think actually even Melody highlighted this when in her presentation, that she got some pushback when she first introduced the kind of 5th pillar, which was FinOps. And so this was really the kind of doubling down that Gartner sees FinOps as a critical component in that core 5th pillar of the category.
I've definitely talked to a few other founders in the space, and I think several of us, we all had differing opinions on whether or not this really belongs in the category. But sounds like there were enough voices, and she made the judgment call that it does belong there. I mean, I get it. It's definitely something that is influenced by, or it's something that you want to understand about the behavior of your platform. I think that I've traditionally approached the space from the lens of like, are my analytics reliable? Are my machine learning models being trained with healthy data? And those types of questions, but understanding the cost implications, even if that's not an attribute of the data itself, it's definitely an adjacent area that's important. And I can see why a lot of teams would have a lot of emphasis on this, especially right now in the current economic environment. So definitely understand the motivation for including it there. And I think this space had very, very little coverage right now from vendors, but I'm sure that'll change over the next year.
Yeah, and if you've got the metadata already, you are able to make those, bring the surface those recommendations. Then you've got a powerful kind of component. So yes, I think as you said, no one covers all 5. Although I'm sure by the time we all return next year, there'll be an updated part of that story.
I think one other thing that's worth mentioning here, there are companies that tackle this problem right now and have for a while. They just don't call themselves data observability companies. I don't know what terminology they're using, but there's a bunch of different offerings out there. Some of them built, very specifically for things like Snowflake and BigQuery, where the pricing model is very well understood. The metadata that you need to compute the pricing impacts is readily available. It's sort of on by default in the warehouse. There's like a number of startups that already address this particular pillar. They're just not flying under the flag of data observability, at least not over the last year or two. But maybe that'll change.
Yeah, and I didn't see so many at Gartner, but definitely at Databricks and Snowflake summits last year. Definitely some standalone vendors looking at this, and typically focused on one platform, which I think actually is one other area that Melody called out, where there was a lack of coverage within the market, which was related to who you can integrate with, and so a lot of the market has been focused on the kind of modern data stack. And one of the call outs that Melody made was validating how well a vendor could support both your modern and your legacy data sources and pipeline tools, ETL tools, etc.
So this was actually one of our topics on the slides. So that was one one sort of warning she had for enterprises. There were a couple other adjacent points that I thought were interesting. So she did hit on that for sure. So two main points she made there that I wrote down in my notes. One was generally lack of support for things that she called legacy data sources. I've joked with people before, do we call this the heritage data stack or the legacy data stack or what? And everybody has their favorite euphemism for it. She said legacy, so I'll roll with that. But she mentioned things like Oracle, DB2, Teradata, stuff like that. There's a lot of data technology out there in the enterprise that is a critical part of the pipeline, and it's an important part of the landscape. And they've got a bunch of business critical pipelines sitting on top of it. And the crop of data observability vendors today has largely been so focused on chasing down Snowflake and Databricks and BigQuery. And then their adjacents, the Fivetrans and things like that, which is super valuable, but it means that their roadmap is fundamentally not oriented towards enterprise needs. And Melody called that out very explicitly, that the current vendor set doesn't tend to cater to a lot of the stuff in the enterprise. Those vendors are still going to be able to find a home in an enterprise because almost every enterprise today has a Snowflake or a Databricks or a BigQuery warehouse somewhere. It just means that it's going to severely limit how much of the pipeline they're actually going to be able to get observability on. And I think that was the key point in her warning.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that. I mean, this is not an easy thing to do. And so there's a lot of engineering work in order to be able to provide that coverage. And so definitely not surprising that limited sections of the market are able to support that.
And I think she didn't go into a ton of detail in it in the talk, but I think it's important to point out that there's a difference between we have a connector for something
Mm-hmm.
and we can talk to the database, or we can actually apply data observability on it. Can you actually profile the data source? Can you actually put metrics on top of it? If all you can do is connect to the source and run SQL checks, that's not really data observability at that point. So I think it's also going to be interesting to see as the market evolves. In the beginning, all the vendors are young and trying to push ahead. And so it's tempting to sort of overmarket what your capabilities are. And so it can look like you have compatibility with the source. And then when you actually look at the docs or you dig in a little bit more, you realize that it's, you kind of have compatibility with it, but not really. So she didn't quite go that far in her warning, but she definitely flagged this generally as a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's part of the maturing of the data observability space is being able to support that broader range of requirements and the kind of, enterprise data stack.
The second thing that she called out here was on-prem. So she had a separate bullet specifically for anyone who's running, they still have some or a lot of on-prem infrastructure. There's a lot of hybrid at this point where people are in the middle of digital transformation, but they're not fully on cloud yet. So she also pointed out general lack of compatibility with on-prem sources. And what that means ultimately is that if you have a hybrid architecture, that you're only going to be able to get observability on part of it. And that creates a problem if your original data sources are still sitting in an on-prem environment and then they're being loaded into Snowflake. It's great if you can monitor Snowflake, but then if something actually goes wrong with whatever's logging in those transactional systems, if you don't have visibility on that, you don't really have complete observability. So she also pointed out that so far there hasn't been a whole lot of emphasis given on support for on-prem or hybrid pipelines.
It's back to that single pane of glass that we were discussing earlier this week. Moving on, I think there was something new that she introduced, as obviously her research has been developing in this area, and that was the concept or a distinction between standalone data observability, which are companies like Bigeye, where we're bringing a data observability solution to the market, and embedded data observability, which is where a company like Snowflake adds data observability components to their offering within Snowflake. And so FinOps is an example of that. Snowflake has functionality to enable you to manage and understand what the drivers are of your compute cost and your overall spend within Snowflake within their own platform. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on this distinction and what that means for the data observability market.
I think It was nice to see it pointed out. One of the very first folks that I met with when we were starting the company was an investor. We weren't raising money. We were just getting feedback on the idea behind the company and validation that the market we were going after made sense. And one of the questions was, how is this not just a feature of one of the big, large scale data warehouses? And legit question, but I think this was the point, is that you can get the embedded observability. Databricks and Snowflake, I think, both announced these features at the same time last year. Well, because the conferences were literally on the same day. So they did announce them at exactly the same time last year. Thankfully, that's not happening again. So they've been in the market for a year now. But these are, like you said, these are point solutions. They give you some degree of observability on that particular platform. But they don't have much incentive to go any further than that. So they're not going to be able to tell you about a whole chunk of the rest of your pipeline. So I'm not totally sure who these appeal to be honest, because it's a good way to kind of get like a flavor or a teaser of like what observability could do. But I just don't see what you're going to do with it unless you can get full visibility on the whole pipeline. And to do that, you need to be able to talk to the ETL system. You need to be able to talk to SAP HANA. You need to be able to talk to Oracle. You need to be able to talk to Tableau. So she called out, as you said, that there's a split between the sort of embedded, I think she called it embedded observability and standalone observability. But she made pretty clear, if your goal is to actually get, like you said, a single pane of glass, your words, not Melody's, but if you actually want visibility over the whole pipeline, the embedded stuff's not going to get you there. And she didn't say anything like, oh, well, you can just take all the embedded observability from each step in the pipeline and stitch it together. I think the assumption is just that that's never really going to happen.
I was asked the same questions, obviously, in the data observability space. Is there a big risk to data observability as soon as all the big, players start to add data observability to their own offerings? And I've always seen it as the opposite. I see it as the validation of the market requirement, an expectation now that they're able to have visibility, within, whether it's in the cloud data warehouse or whether it's, in the ETL tool. But unless if you are only operating in one platform or one tool and you have a super simple setup, that may be sufficient for you. But that definitely will not be the case at the enterprise. And so it validates the requirements, but then in order to be able to pull all of that, all of those inputs together, that's the need for the data observability platform. So to me, the two go very much hand in hand with the kind of growth of the industry. So it's great to see those embedded, I think, solutions coming forward, and they will meet the need for some smaller companies, but not at the enterprise or even close to that.
I think one thing that could be nice is, depending on how they're implemented, if there's a lot of pre-computation happening by the vendor on their own technology, and they can optimize the gathering of the various sort of observability metrics or statistics that are needed, if they can do that in a way that is designed natively for their own platform and then serve that up in an API in a really neat way, then that could be great for folks like us, because then we can consume that out of an API instead of having to instrument it directly. And we can get very, very clever with our instrumentation methods. And we do that. We do a lot of work to try to reduce query load and optimize things, but it's never going to be to the degree that they can do it natively with their own in-house engineering. And so that potentially is one advantage, is the more embedded observability sort of solutions that we see in major technologies throughout the pipeline, that potentially has advantages for folks like us that are pulling it all together under one roof and exposing it in one place for the user, because we can now leverage sort of their native optimizations.
Exactly, because before these weren't even available through an API. And so that's the shift that you're seeing, is now you can pull that from the API, open API, and that increases the what we're able to do then with that data as well. And it reminded me, we were talking with a customer this week about another big shift in the kind of data market is the improvement of those integrations and the ability of different platforms to really be able to work well together. And this is an example, I think, of where that kind of embedded data observability, pulling into a data observability platform across your whole data stack, is an example of that.
Yep, absolutely. I see a comment here came in from Andrew. Objective observability platforms taking advantage of embedded functionality, multiple sources will be the winners. I agree. I just think this is the way that it'll go over time. And then the question is, who will the holdouts be in being able to provide, statistics and metrics? And then I think the other thing will be, as a company that is focused solely on observability, we're thinking all the time about things like, what information do I want out of that data source that a data engineer or an analyst would want to use when they're doing root cause analysis or when they're trying to understand why something happened. And so there may be, I can see sort of a cat and mouse game a little bit, where sort of a bunch of information gets served up natively from APIs, let's say from Snowflake or from Astronomer or whatever. We consume that, but then we start thinking about additional information that we want. And then we're going to go and instrument that outside of their native API, and then maybe it'll get folded back in later. And so I can kind of see this rolling sort of evolution of how much observability data we're able to pull out of those platforms. And then there will be the laggards that just don't instrument anything, and we have to kind of do it the hard way. But that's value that we'll produce, and that way our customers don't have to deal with that engineering work of saying like, hey, this transactional data store doesn't have a native query log. How are we going to get the information about the table refreshing times out of it? And that's a problem that we'll solve, and that's our job.
I feel we've already started to talk about futures, which I think is what is
that's right. That's right.
Next. So yeah, we skipped through. So Gartner isn't stopping with its 5 pillars, but in just a single line item, single bullet, kind of gave us as vendors and broader industry an indication of what they saw could be included in the future of data observability. 2 areas pretty close to my heart and experience, but I'll leave you to introduce them.
I don't know. I think that you should know. I mean, you've spent significant time in these areas. I've dabbled a bit, but I've not actually worked directly at these companies before.
So yeah, the 2 areas that potentially may become a core part of data observability that Melody introduced were both privacy and security. She didn't give any details about, how. And I don't know whether this is just kind of like throwing down the gauntlet for the market to come back, just as I've started thinking about this quite a lot, and kind of come back with suggestions. But I thought it was a very interesting development. And as I've been saying to you, when I moved from the kind of privacy tech industry into the data observability space, a lot of my network and kind of contacts were initially very excited and came to me kind of going, oh, that sounds amazing because you'll be able to do this, and gave me those use cases of how they saw, the potential applications of data observability within the privacy space in particular. And so it's interesting to see that Gartner's starting to pick up on that. And some of those examples obviously are being able to not just be able to discover your PII, but be able to ensure compliance with how PII data moves through your pipeline. And having the kind of the potential power to control and ensure compliance with some of those policies that you've put in place. I know there are definitely people that would be very excited about that.
And you and I talked before, there's the labeling and identification aspect. Mm-hmm. And in the past, when we've gotten questions about that, I've said, hey, go take a look at Bigeye or something like that does the automatic identification piece. And that's a problem that I worked on at a past life also, is like, what heuristics can we use to identify if a field looks like it contains PII in it? So there's the identification step. That seems like an easy place for a data observability company to go, because it's one step removed from kind of what we're already doing with profiling and what metrics make sense to track about the data based on what it looks like and that kind of thing. I think the more interesting piece for me is the control aspect, because on the sort of quality and pipeline side, what we've always been talking about is, how do we get to, there's circuit breakers, but like, how do we get to self-healing pipelines? How do we get to automated backfills? If we see that these types of things go bump in the night, can we attempt to remediate those in the background before we have to, pager duty or wake up a person or whatever? There's a similar analog on the privacy side that you kind of alluded to, which is, there's the identification piece. And then there's the question of how do we hook into the pipeline, or how do we hook into other tools and products so that based on the identification, we can actually take preventative action, not just the observability piece. Because I think this is actually going back to the is very early in Melody's talk about the observability update, but she showed this like pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid was the remediation piece and being able to automate the fixes. And so I think everybody agrees that that's sort of the final stage. And I think it's okay if the market is not quite there yet, but everybody's hungry for how do you get me to the place where you're not just doing the monitoring and the identification, but you're also, you have the hooks into things and you can actually take action on that. And I think in privacy and security, that's not a nice to have. That's like a huge value add. Maybe even more so than it is on sort of the pipeline reliability area.
Yeah, I definitely see some very interesting potential. There are some other companies working in the space, I think in the security space, a little bit less so in the privacy space, partly because probably they haven't connected to all the different systems and created that kind of foundation that the data observability tools have that would enable the execution of this. Because doing that for just a privacy use case potentially wouldn't make sense. But obviously, if you're already covering the other 5 pillars and you're already getting all of the value in terms of your overall business value that you're creating, then adding this in definitely makes sense versus buying a kind of standalone solution. So yeah, watch this space for how privacy and security might become a part of this category moving forward.
We can take bets on whether they're going to be pillars 6 and 7 unveiled next year or not.
Exactly. We've talked a lot about data observability, unsurprisingly. I don't know, there were some other things. I don't know if you wanted to highlight, you mentioned some of the Tableau features that you saw.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, so we have a slide about the new venue, which
We'll come back to new venue. Super excited. We'll leave that up there so everyone can look at it in the meantime whilst we talk a little bit more about that before we move on to the venue.
Yeah, I had a very minor item in my notes about this, but just when I was walking around the exhibit floor, I saw this new product announcement from Tableau. And I don't think that they're marketing it as data observability. Probably a good idea, but something that we've seen done in the past is leveraging our platform to monitor business metrics. And that is not the primary thing that we're designing for. That's not the primary direction on our roadmap. But at the end of the day, tracking a statistic in a database and putting a forecasting algorithm on it and then flagging when it's doing something weird, that could be a freshness metric about how stale a table is, or it could be your aggregate revenue number. And from a technical standpoint, it's the same problem. It's a presentation question. And so we have seen people in the past use Bigeye to monitor, for example, changes in user sign-up rate or user referral rates, and then they can split it out by a whole bunch of interesting dimensions. And so you can kind of hack the platform that way to use it for business metric monitoring. But Tableau's just gone ahead and actually built that as a specific feature oriented towards reporting insights on business metrics. And I just thought it's a great use case. It's something that's very in line with their user base, and it's presented in a way that's very digestible, at least based on what I saw, to an executive who might be scrolling through a feed on their phone. And they're getting these small snapshots of here's the metric, here's the past behavior on it, here's why we flag this as an insight, and usually it looks like there's some link or something, some call to action to sort of dig into it and learn more. But I just thought it looked great, good feature, well designed. The information presentation was good. They didn't do a pie chart.
So you carried on looking.
So I kept looking at it. Yeah, but I took a note about it because I thought it was such a great looking feature, and it was sort of one of those like, well, duh, like why didn't they build this earlier? It makes total sense. So super interesting feature. I thought it looked nicely designed and presented, so I took a note about it.
And happy to talk about this because we'll be at the Tableau conference next month and probably finding out more about this, and happy to share what our additional insights after that conference on kind of LinkedIn, etc. Because we're also focused on how we can make things easy for the analyst and the Tableau user, and so look forward to sharing some of what we've been working on in that area too.
So the venue,
yes.
So sadly, this was the last year at the Swan and Dolphin.
I will miss pacing the floors between when you suddenly realize the session you want to get to is in the opposite end of the other hotel, and you've got to and it's at least a 15-minute you get your steps in the current setup.
So they're moving to the Gaylord Palms, which I have never been to, so I'm excited to see a new venue. B, I'm a bit of a Disney fan, so I'm a little bit sad that it's not. I know the Swan and Dolphin was never like a super Disney hotel, but at least it was right next to Epcot. You could walk over and go to Epcot or something like that. So slightly further away, little sad about that. I did check though. One thing that I was paying attention to is it wildly different in terms of travel time from the Orlando airport, and it is not. It's basically 3 minutes down the road from the Swan and Dolphin.
I don't know. The Gartner team told me that it was closer to the airport, so you've just crushed that hope.
No, it looks it's basically across the street almost. So I mean, maybe it is technically close to the airport, but it's not like it's not in Orlando proper. It's still in Kissimmee. It's still right outside of sort of the Disney parks. So.
More, I mean, what this actually means is, I don't remember the exact number, but it was about 5,100 or 5,300 people at the conference this year. Definitely the biggest data analytics summit they've had. That continued growth in data analytics is what's driving the shift to a bigger venue. So ultimately, this is about the growth of the space, although we look forward to seeing how that plays out and enjoying a new venue next year.
Also, they have a surf simulator.
Oh, okay.
So you could try surfing if you want. So, I mean, you can, I assume a lot of people are going to this, maybe a day before or staying a few days after and having some fun with their family. So while I was checking out the website for the Gaylord Palms, I did see they have a surf simulator, which is pretty exciting.
Okay, so if you have one takeaway from this surf simulator at Gartner Data Analytics next year,
that should be the main takeaway from the whole live stream, yes.
As well as the 7 pillars. Okay, and to wrap up, we're looking forward to doing this all again at the Gartner Data Analytics Summit, which is coming up pretty quickly in middle of May, 13th to 15th of May in London.
And you'll be there attending. So if you're going to stop by, say hello. Sadly, I can't make it this time. Hopefully I can go next year. Also, saw that there were a couple comments in here during the stream. Would also love to keep chatting after the stream. Send me a direct message on LinkedIn, or there's my email. Happy to chat on email as well. Eleanor's up there as well. If you haven't connected with either of us, please shoot us a connection request. Would love to chat with you. And not only will we be at the summit, but we'll do another recap after the London summit and go over any additional notes or observations there.
Yep, I'll get to share everything that I learn whilst we're there. Looking forward to it. So yeah, do connect on LinkedIn, and our emails are there. And very happy. Oh, we have a question coming in. Very happy to connect either in London or on email in the meantime.
Looks like great question from Greg here. Earlier in the discussion, you mentioned users cannot have all data from on-prem and cloud environments in one model. Is that because it would require custom migration utilities for legacy and on-prem or other issues? Great question, Greg. I mean, it's really a deployment question. So the challenge is that you need to get a connector to the data source, and that connector's got to gather your observability metrics from it and then report them back to wherever the control plane is running. So for example, we run our default control plane in AWS West, but we've got to be able to pull the observability metrics from your Snowflake, from your BigQuery, from Redshift or whatever. That's pretty easy because they're all cloud. But if you have data sources, let's say you have a bunch of Oracle databases that are in an on-prem environment, we've got to get a collector that can interface with those data sources. And we have done some work recently to support on-prem. We're going to be announcing with a lot more detail about this actually next week. But traditionally, a lot of the observability companies have really been focused on monitoring data sources that are sitting in an AWS VPC or a Google Cloud environment. And they just haven't developed deployment methods that allow them to get a connector to talk to the on-prem source. And so that means if you've got some on-prem, then you're ETLing it into a cloud data warehouse. They can monitor the cloud data warehouse, but they don't have a way to talk to the data source that's sitting in the on-prem environment. And so you get a gap in how much observability you're going to be able to get. I'm sure that all of the vendors will develop a solution for that at some point once they try to work with enough enterprise customers. But for example, we work with a few banks, and those banks are not moving some of that data up to the cloud. It's going to be on-prem for quite a while. So that's a challenge that we've had to tackle. Great question. And I see Adriana's posted our LinkedIn's in there as well. So hope to connect with you. I think that takes us pretty much to the end of the stream. Eleanor, good to chat with you as always. And yeah, look forward to swapping notes on the next one.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.